All right. Well, yeah, welcome everybody to the Mastermind Deep Dive. So, once a month, as a Mastermind Club group, we get together and talk on a very technical, deep topic. Last time it was HVAC, and trying to figure out how to get the air out of your Bitcoin mines to keep them cool. This month, we're talking about very specifically the costs involved in developing your site. Um, so yeah, as we get started this morning, just make sure your microphones are muted. And then at the end, we're going to have time for questions and answers. You don't have to stick around, like I was saying earlier. You don't have to stick around for the Q&A. Feel free to leave anytime. We are recording this, and we will provide the link afterwards to the Mastermind Club members. And just to share a little bit about what this whole thing is, the Mastermind Club is a mentorship group that we have. We get together every week and try to hold each other accountable to getting our projects done. And there's so many different things that we can do to, get each other over different hurdles that we're experiencing. A lot of us have experience in different fields. Some of us are money people. Some of us are construction people. Some of us are project managers. Some of us know IT infrastructure, right? And so there's so much we could do to help each other, and that's what this mastermind club is all about. But today, what we're doing is we're just having a little sneak peek here for free for non-members and members alike, to really to hone in and share some of this wisdom and information that we've been able to distill here over the last couple of years of doing this together. So if this sounds like something that you want to be a part of, if being in a team, in a group of other people, helping each other to meet our common goals of building industrial scale Bitcoin mines. If that's something that is interesting to you, then definitely reach out to us afterwards, and we'll tell you how to get signed up. But I won't hold this back any further. I'll introduce Joe. Joe Lively is our facilitator this morning, and I think Taylor Towler might be on as well, and maybe he'll chime in with a few comments as well. And also Trevor Bello is leading this up with me as well this morning, and we'll give feedback as well on his perspective on and experience on things as a new learner in the mining industry. So Trevor is very passionate about Bitcoin, and he's on the journey. We're trying to fast track Trevor as fast as we can to learn as much as we can, because we want him to help us to be a voice in this industry and in this ecosystem that we're trying to build here. So yeah, thank you, Taylor, for joining as well. Definitely feel free to unmute your microphone and introduce yourself, and chime in when Joe makes a point. But yeah, anyway, overall, we're going to try to keep this to about 45 minutes, and we'll have some Q&A at the end. So Joe, why don't you go ahead, introduce yourself, and let us know how to save money and figure out exactly how much money goes into a project like this, and everything that's all involved in specking out your site.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Scott. For those who I haven't met in person, my name is Joe Lively. I've been in the Bitcoin mining space for about 5 years now. I guess time flies. And Bitcoin since 2016. Like many of you, I started in my garage. Got my first couple ASICs back in 2019, and thought this was just the coolest thing. What I liked about it is I was able to control my own destiny. I was able to go through and work with the machines to actually mine in the Bitcoin network. And you don't know until you know. And so what was cool about it was the path of discovery I took when I started mining. So I didn't know much about it. I actually kind of thought maybe I'm not really how it worked. And so going through and actually picking up my first couple ASICs was really opened my eyes. And then from there, like a lot of us, you want to have more. But I was limited by my infrastructure here. At my little town here in Oregon, we don't have a lot of options. The options that we do have are pretty expensive. And in order to go through and increase the infrastructure that I would need to go through and mine even 10, 12, 15 machines here actually seemed cost prohibitive. So what I started doing is looking at different sites. And as part of this club, we've gone through and talked about different aspects of that. We've talked about going through and looking for the ideal site. and how to look at different power companies and what their rates are and the difference between energy cost and all-in costs. And today we're going to focus on what it would actually be like to pay for the cost of building an actual mine. And there's lots of different ways to physically do that. But what we're going to do is talk about two different ways. And we're going to focus mostly on a containerized solution. Warehousing is something that a lot of people do. They build up a site intentionally, or there's an existing warehouse that they're converting. But what I'd like to do to make it easier to talk about costs from a more generic standpoint is use containers. So in the session today, we're going to talk about a build-out overview. What's the best structure and what might work. And we're going to go into electrical equipment, site development itself, transportation costs, shipping, those type of things. Talk about what we might need to do with our utilities or power companies in order to actually get the power to us. A little bit about interconnection and what kind of those costs look like. We'll talk about labor and what actually goes inside of these containers as part of that process. The neat thing about this whole exercise here is we want you to kind of get an idea of what it would cost if you were building one out. When I'm talking about pricing, I'm going to use the industry standard of per megawatt pricing. So what does it cost per megawatt? Now, I don't want you to get confused. When I mention that is I don't really think it makes a lot of sense to build just a single megawatt site. We're going to talk a little bit about economies of scale, and I'm going to give you some examples of a 10 megawatt site that I was part of building out and a 2 megawatt site I'm building out now. And I want you to kind of see the differences of how the economy scales affect your per megawatt price. But for consistency, as much as it can be in this industry, we do like to use that per megawatt nomenclature when discussing pricing. As I mentioned a little earlier, there are two real ways to go through and build out a Bitcoin mining site. You can do it from the container standpoint, or you can do it from a warehouse standpoint. Warehouses can actually be cheaper on a per megawatt pricing figure just because you're not having to go through and buy the engineering expertise from a containerized company. What I mean by that is companies like Giga and Digital Shovel and even Antbox to a degree have put years and countless hours in time of refining and building their product out to take into account heat, airflow, security, efficiencies. They're going through and putting in smart PDUs or dumb PDUs depending on your setup. So they've gone through and had multiple iterations to that. When you build a warehouse, it could really be as simple as a pole building with some filters that come in and some fans that exhaust out. Now, I'm not saying there's not a lot of engineering that could go into a very effective warehouse design, but I'm just saying when you're buying a containerized solution, you're not just buying the infrastructure, you're buying all the engineering and design work that went into that to get it to that point. As far as cost for a containerized solution, right now, as I'm talking about most of these items, things are a little more expensive. Much like Bitcoin ASICs that you're probably experienced with, a lot of the items in the Bitcoin mining industry are commodities. So buying a container in January of 2022 was going to be much cheaper than buying a container today. Same with transformers, switchgear, or anything along that nature that is tied directly to Bitcoin or Bitcoin mining. As we experience more of a bull run and more people get excited about this and more people can envision building and mine, the equipment's going to go up. Along with that is the lead time going up. Time to go through and buy a container, buy a transformer, get a switchgear or a primary metering cabinet are going to go up exponentially. In fact, you could do a poll in the people who know in this room. It's damn near impossible to get a primary metering cabinet today under 6 months. And so these are things that we'll talk a little bit about. On top of cost is the lead time that goes into some of these things. All right. So before I get too far into these things, the main thing people think about when they're going through and building a site is I got to have a container and I got to have a transformer. For the most part, that's what people who are new to this, that's what they got to have. But there is so much more potential equipment that you can need in order to get up and running than just those two things. If you're buying a container, The cool thing about it is most of them, almost all of them, come with switchgear built in. And so I actually know a few people who will buy amp boxes just so they can get access to the switchgear to use in other applications because the amp boxes are pretty cheap. But on top of these two things, there are other items. Let's start off on the right-hand side, the PMC, the primary metering cabinet. If you're coming into a site development process, you'll come in two different ways. Secondary, where in theory, the power company is supposed to provide the primary metering cabinet, the transformer, and you pay a higher cost for the energy, and they're responsible for all the maintenance. In primary, you may be responsible for buying the primary metering cabinets, the transformers, and responsible for all the maintenance that goes on there. In the co-op that I'm currently working with, they don't pay for anything. They don't provide anything whatsoever in primary or secondary. And so there's really no benefit to going in as secondary because they don't do any of the maintenance. They don't provide any of the equipment. And so those are things you really want to start to look at. These costs start to add up quite quickly. When I was building out this first site down here local to me, they didn't mention any of the cost of the primary metering cabinets or other things that were required by them. And so I came in under budget by about $150,000 once it was all said and done, just because I didn't know the right questions to ask when I first got into it. In my particular jurisdiction, something called a VFI, which is essentially an air gap between my components and their components, is required. They will not allow us to go through and do anything over a megawatt without having a VFI. Those things are about $20,000. So combining the VFI and the PMC that I didn't know, right there was roughly about $70,000 of equipment that I hadn't expected as I was talking to other people in the industry about what was required to build out. And the reason they didn't know, it wasn't because they didn't know it was needed. It was just that it wasn't required in their jurisdiction. So every single place is going to be a little different. I'm here located in Oregon, and we've got some pretty stringent rules on what's required for building sites out. If you're in places like, I guess Texas would be a great example. Not a lot of code enforcement. You could go through and drop your containers on gravel. They probably don't require certain amounts of equipment that we require here in Oregon. So picking your location is really important if you're trying to keep an eye on CapEx. Another thing that's pretty important is a pad mount. They call them PMEs. And basically, it's a fuse disconnect that allows you to go through and add in multiple runs. So you can have a 200 amp run for one container and another 200 amp run from a secondary container. And that way, if one of those has an issue, you don't lose the whole site. You only lose one particular fused connection there. And again, that's another requirement here in Oregon for us. They're spendy as well. So most of these pieces of equipment are anywhere from $20,000 to $50,000, depending on availability and time that you go to physically purchase them. As I mentioned, everything in this industry is a commodity. Buying, they say the theme that's out there is you want to build in a bear market. One of the reasons for that is this exact concept here. All these things are essentially 30, 40, even 50% cheaper when no one wants to build Bitcoin mines. When everyone's excited like they are now, we got the halving coming up, everyone's expecting a price pump, everyone's thinking, I want to build a Bitcoin mine right now. Well, industry knows that, prices go up and act like a commodity. And then finally, transformers. Transformers are hard to get nowadays. You could basically find them anywhere a year ago, and they were much less cost. In fact, the site I was helping kind of working on for development back in Texas, they are put a pin in it. They started developing it out in August last year. They had delays and delays and delays. And finally, they had to go back to their investors in February and say, we need another $400,000 because we didn't buy the transformers and the containers in October when we should have. And their investors pulled out of the project. So keeping an eye on this electrical equipment is going to be one of your biggest capital costs on a project. All righty. The next thing is, where are we putting all of this equipment? This was something that actually surprised me on how much it really cost to take a greenfield site and move from waving grass to actually having pads up, gravel, and trenching. There was a lot of work that goes in this process. And ever since COVID really happened, labor costs have gone tremendously upwards. So these are something that you really need to budget for. Get multiple quotes from people. Talk to your city. Find out what permits are actually required. What I mean by that is some states require permits, electrical permits, building permits, conditional use permits. I think, Trevor, you have mentioned fencing permits are a thing in some places and stuff like that. So having a good idea for those things are super important. When we were prepping land, I found a couple good contractors. That was one of the easiest things to find because they were excited about the process. They didn't know much about Bitcoin mining, so they want to kind of learn about it as they went along. So I got some pretty good deals there. But it's still expensive. Going through and actually doing the pads for the container and the transformers and all the other switchgear type equipment was, just under $10,000. My dad used to own a concrete company. When I was going through and helping him out when I was 16, 17 years old, it was $58.50 a yard. So to hear those type of numbers quoted really blew my mind as I was building this stuff out. And then rigging. A lot of people don't account for the actual cost to get the items off of the truck and get them placed onto their pads. I talked to a group that I'm working with up here in North Oregon, and it cost them $4,500 for, I think it was 2.5 days of getting all their containers off. And because they hadn't really organized they're putting them on pylons. They hadn't organized their pylons correctly. They had to go through and set them on the ground, readjust the pylons, lift them back up there. So it cost a lot of extra money. All said and done with all the rigging, they were actually probably in it for $7,500 because of all the extra moving they had to do around as part of that process. So having your site well designed, graded, ready to go through and place your equipment is super important to not spend extra costs. I saw there's a lot of cool stuff going on in the chat as far as subject matter experts like Dan and Taylor posting some content in there. Make sure you're checking that out. Because, we're going to get to copper wiring because it is definitely a high cost to this process. Transportation. This is another thing I did not really budget for. When I bought my containers, 2 megawatts worth of containers, so about 2 truckfuls of containers, I hadn't really budgeted in what it's going to cost to get them from Eastern Canada to the Western United States. Contacted multiple people. At the end of the day, $20,000 is what it cost last year when I was going to do this to get them on 2 truckloads driven from Eastern Canada all the way to here in Oregon. I had not budgeted for that. I had maybe like $5,000 budgeted for it. And going through and looking at the cost of not just those, but adding in the cost of shipping for the transformers, the PMEs, the primary metering cabinets, I'm probably going to have about $50,000 in shipping by the time everything is on site and done. Super expensive. It's not like shipping UPS for these equipments. They're all on flatbed trucks. They're all through freight companies. And when we had the supply chain issues in late 2021, early 2022, it was really hard to get a trucker to drive this stuff back and forth. Plus, because I'm coming from Canada, I've got extra taxes I got to pay coming in and out of the United States and stuff like that. So keep an eye on where you're procuring your stuff. Texas is a great place. If you're building in Texas, there's a lot of equipment already sitting there. You need an amp box in Texas, it's probably right around the corner. Utility upgrades. This is something that you need to nail immediately. This can destroy a project or this can make a project. What I mean by that is really finding out what your power company needs to do in order to facilitate the capacity. A lot of people will just pick up the phone and be a phone power ranger and call power company, and ask you the questions. Do you have capacity for 10 megawatts? Do you have capacity for 5 megawatts? If you're not talking to the lead engineer, you may get a real quick answer like yes or no. They say yes, you may think everything's great. That yes oftentimes comes with a lot of caveats. You're going to have to look at possibly their transformers within their substation may need to be upgraded. I talked to a group here in Vale, Oregon, and they said they could do 10 megawatts, but in order for us to do that, we're going to have to go through and update the transformers, the distribution feeder. They're going to have to do a complete rebuild of the overhead system there. They're going to have to go through and bring in other equipment and labor. Probably going to take about 3 to 3.5 years. The cost was astronomical to do that. And they have no real incentive to do it. Again, Bitcoin mining, the concept says, hey, we're helping upgrade utilities and build out the infrastructure so we can support EVs and better grids. If they don't know about the monetization of what Bitcoin can bring to them, they don't care to upgrade unless they're forced to upgrade, either through some kind of subsidy from the government, or they just have to because of organic demand through housing and businesses in the area. To go through and turn on a 10 megawatt site for a guy like me or you guys, that's not really in their playbook unless they have a lot of education. So really making sure that you have a full grasp of what it takes to upgrade their site if needed for your capacity as the first thing you need to do. The site I'm working at right now, $70,000 for an upgrade. And that's just elbows and interconnection lines and things like that. It's very, very simple stuff. Another one that we were working on in North Oregon, $255,000 is what it came out to be. They quoted us $175,000. So we've actually built out that site, and they quoted $175,000. By the time it was all done, it was over $250,000. So even if they say it's going to be this amount, they're not going to just eat that cost. They're going to push that onto you because you're the person requesting the service. Taylor mentioned this. Cabling is extremely expensive. There's multiple ways you can go for interconnection, but in my case, I'm paying not only from my mid-voltage stuff to my containers, which is a 250-foot run, but I'm also paying for the substation to our primary metering cabinet on the utility side. Expensive. They quoted me at $21 a foot, essentially, which sounds like a good deal, but they're really talking about a single run there. If I'm on 3-phase, I'm running 4 cables as part of that process. And so you really have to look at what that cost is. So now if you're $80 a foot for the run and you're going 250 feet, what is that, 20 grand? Now you're also saying, how far am I from the substation? If I'm 900 feet from the substation, how does that work? And so these costs really start to come up in price. And so knowing how you're going to position yourself and finding a spot that's maybe closer to a substation or having your equipment that is able to be right next to the junction box will reduce the cost you have to have for actually building out your site. None of this happens by just making a wish. We need people. In this industry, most of our costs are actually made up by labor, whether it is your contractor, whether it is a utility company, whether it's your electrician, whether it's you. There's a cost associated with you actually getting down there and digging those trenches for those 250 feet. Renting backhoe equipment, paying people to run that if you don't know how to run that particular equipment. All those costs really come into the calculations. And when I look at a lot of people who are new to doing these things, and I look at their performance for site building, none of that's usually in there. Maybe they'll have a little asterisk like labor kind of for $5,000. But that is one of the key components here. I got digital shuffle boxes. And when I was quoted by the contractor to go through and help me assemble those boxes, he said basically, because he knew nothing about them, he thought, well, it'd probably take a week to build, and I need 4 people doing this as part of that process. So I was quoted like $10,000 to build those boxes. It's not that hard to do. And working with the manufacturer, I was able to go through and get an idea of what it took him to build it and the hours it took for his unskilled labor to kind of come in and help him get those things bolted together as part of the process. I was able to get it done for $2,000. And so these things are really important to really look at as you're scoping your budgeting for this process. when I was first doing this, I guess this would have been 2021. I was looking for a engineer to go through and help me build out the site that was south of me, and figuring out what it would cost to go through and build out the project. There are a lot of companies out there that when you talk to them, I left the logo on here on purpose because I'll never do business with them. I'm sure they're great people, but they are essentially chasing away Bitcoin miners because they don't want to deal with it. But essentially, what they did is they wanted to bill me $8,800 for the quote to do the project. For the quote. So that would have been the time for them to go through and look at what it would cost to build it out, what it would cost to acquire the cable, what it would cost to hire the labor, to basically run the project. Was just under $9,000. At the end, I turned them down, obviously, but I asked them, you've done these projects before for other people along the Columbia River and stuff. What a project like this cost? He said to run the project, they charged one group $300,000. Now, that's not equipment. That's their engineering designs. That's their project management. That's their people that they hire to kind of run this particular project. And so be careful when you're talking to different groups. I was able to go to another group and I got all the designs, the engineer blueprints, and everything for $3,000. And they were able to consult with me for 2 hours before even billing me to make sure they really understood the project. Whereas this group didn't want to have more than a half-hour meeting without billing me for $200. Shop around. There's lots of people out there who now understand this business a little bit more. This is a traditional engineering firm that builds factories. They're good people. They do good work, but they aren't really aligned with the Bitcoin mining industry. All right, so once you've got your land prepped, you've got your equipment on the land, you've got all of your high side and your mid level voltage all hooked up, your containers are hooked up, you walk in there, there's nothing in there. You have to actually be able to hook up your ASICs. And I know this is a silly thing to think about it, but I've talked to a lot of people who didn't even budget for cables, like connection cables for the ASICs. And so that's something you need to keep an eye on. These things aren't expensive per se, but they add up. On a megawatt level or something like that, you're probably looking at like $3,000 just for cables. Going up in the one I was doing, it cost me $5,800 if I was going to go through and retrofit that 1.8 megawatt container. Scott, maybe you know this. I haven't actually got my S21s, or maybe Ron knows. Are they coming with cables now? Is that something that's happening with the S21s?
Yeah, sometimes, but we do sell them separately. If if the length doesn't quite work out for you on the miner or on the cable that they send you, you can get longer and shorter ones. So
Yeah, they typically come with the C20 to the P13 cable in the box, but you still need to connect the P20 to something. So you're going to have PDUs, perhaps length extenders, extensions, that sort of thing.
Thank you very much, Ron. Yeah, and that's why I put this kind of up there. If you've ever looked inside a container, you've got containers that understand cable management, and then you've got normal people who just plug everything in. Cables are interesting because, again, it may sound like an OCD thing to have them at the proper lengths. Like in this chart here, 2 foot, 3 foot, 4 foot, 5 foot. It does matter because if you're not bundling these things up, they can easily impede the airflow of your ASICs themselves. So something as small as just bad cable management where they're draping in front of the ASICs can actually go through and affect the heat spots within your container. So going through and getting the right Y cables and the right lengths and stuff like that are super important. Depending on your containerized solution, you may have switches in there. You're still going to have to get internet in there to begin with. So whether using 5G or fiber or Starlink, all that equipment has to be purchased and set up as part of that process. You probably don't want to be using Netgear or D-Link routers. You should be using something like Cisco or something along those lines inside of your 1 megawatt container as part of that process. They're not cheap. They're worth it, but they're definitely not cheap. So you want to kind of budget for all those things, go around and talk to people and what the costs are and what the best internal equipments are. Ethernet cables, not super expensive, but you probably want to do custom length and learn how to make your own cables. Because, again, you want to have good cable management within your systems. All right, what else are we going to talk about? All right, so from here, I want to talk a little bit about the site that I'm building out. This is a true greenfield site. These are real pictures of my substation and the field in which I've purchased to go through and build this. It's a small site now, but it has potential. They're going to work on over the next couple of years building up that substation to be able to support me in a larger capacity. But right now, the max they can do is 2 megawatts. For me, as an owner operator, it's a perfect size for me because I have very low overhead. I mentioned earlier, it doesn't make a lot of sense to build a 1 megawatt site. You can, but you really have to make sure you have a right mix of power. You're not into a land loan where you're having to pay a huge amount of cost. You're not hiring people. The second you do any of those things, the idea of a 1 megawatt farm goes out the window completely. Even a 2 megawatt one is close, but it's enough to let me go through and substitute out my 9-to-5 job and be able to earn enough income so that I don't have to work at that 9-to-5 job any longer. So this is the site I'm working at, and I'm going to give you real numbers. I've taken some of the details away, but this is actually the budget that we've put together to build the site. Everything's been quoted by actual people as of the last month. So how does all this stuff I talked about earlier actually pencil out? So this is kind of the idea here. We had to pay about $6,500 in permits to go through and actually get this work. That's between electrical, conditional use as part of that process, and a couple other little things we had to do. I mentioned I paid $3,000 for the site design. So that's going through and doing the engineer diagrams that I could hand to the permitting office, as well as to the contractor, the utility, and my electrical person who's doing that. They all need to be speaking a common language and have an understanding of your plan. To do that could be as much as $300,000 or as little as $3,000 as part of that process. I'm not going to grade out the whole site. I'm going to do it in phases because my next phase is going to be a warehouse. The first phase is going to be a container. So I'm only doing about a quarter of the land. But to go through and grade it all out and to do the trenching for the conduit, for the cables and the fiber and all that stuff is around $4,500. Gravel to get in. I need a 12-foot driveway to get in for trucks for delivery, and just it's smart to have down the road. And then a little area where we could go through and drop the containers and stuff like that. We're looking at right around $7,000, $8,000 for the gravel. The actual hooking up of power for my electrician to go through and run this was $45,000. Now that includes my runs of the cable. I'm using copper, and we've reduced the length that we're going to run it as part of that process. But yeah, it was 45 grand all said and done for the electrical engineer or electrical contractor to be able to do that. That's not trenching or any of that other stuff or the conduit. I'm covering those costs independently. Fence. I didn't even think fence was nearly this expensive. But yeah, 5 grand just to go around the container itself. It was 30 grand to go around the whole property. So I kind of cheaped out for this first phase, and I'm just doing it around the container. Transformer, we were able to get one earlier before all this crazy price hike. So we got $50,000 for that. At one point, I was seeing them for like $35,000, $40,000 back in 2021, 2022, or not 2021, but the bear market 2022. Now I'm seeing them in the range of like $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 for a 3750. I mean, they're really creeping up. I hate this primary metering cabinet with every fiber of my being. So hard to find them. I tried 5 or 6 different used ones. The utility company would not take a used one. They billed me out. They wanted to charge me $25,000 for the metering cabinet, which no biggie. 55-week lead time is the best they could have done from their vendor. So I had to go out and work with another group to find a vendor who will physically build one to their specs. 15-week lead time, so still enough time that I got to wait for it. But it cost me $55,000 for that to happen. That's including shipping. So it's $50,000 plus $5 grand for shipping. It's coming from Canada. Awesome. The utility work. After I went through and broke down, I told you it was $70,000. That's when they were quoting me for a primary metering cabinet and the PME5. I went through and sourced those out myself. And again, they had $20,000 in there for their PME, or for their primary metering, but I wasn't going to wait a year for that to happen. Concrete's expensive, more expensive than it should be. So to go through and have the actual materials and the labor in there to go through and do that, and we require rebar and actually putting in posts where you have to weld the container to the posts that are in the concrete. That's why all that expense is actually in there. The containers, got them early, got them cheaper. So 2 megawatts for $165,000. Rigging and assembly to physically build them, that is a higher estimate than we thought. We actually got them much cheaper than that, so I still have that in there from the old Performa. Cables, parts, routers, things like that, $7,500. We always try to put a buffer in there for our projects. It's super important. The one I mentioned up there in North Oregon, where they went through and they quoted 175 and it turned out to be 250 for the utility upgrades. There was no buffer in there. And so the primary on there had to end up selling Bitcoin at $30,000 to do so, to cover that extra cost. Obviously, he regrets it, but he's up and hashing now with 3 megawatts up there, so he's happy that it's going. But again, he regrets obviously having to sell coin to make the project happen. And then shipping for the actual mobile data center, we ended up finding another group because we waited longer. Now the quote is $15,000 as opposed to $20,000 because of the just shipping logistics have gotten easier, supply chains easier. There's more drivers who want to work as part of that process. So shipping prices have actually come down. You take out that full build cost of this thing, we're looking at like $473,000 for about 2 megawatts. And so if you divide that out for industry standard on a per megawatt basis, $236,000 per megawatt is what we're looking at for this 2 megawatt site. It's a lot of money. And that's not including any of the land acquisition costs whatsoever. So this is just going through and taking a green piece of grass, assuming you own it, and building up. So here's where economies of scale come in. I was working with another group. I was actually partnered with them for a bit until things went sideways. They were building out a 10 megawatt facility in Texas. Less permitting, really no permitting, less restrictions and codes issues. Things are closer for shipping, so that's less of a cost. And it's just easier to build out there. Also, it was at scale. Like I mentioned, it's a 10 megawatt facility. This is right off of the sheet that they presented to the partners, their investment firm, when they were going through and building this out in October. All in 10 megawatts, $1.6 million, 1.689. But so you look at that, it's like, how is that possible? You're buying in quantities. You're going through and working in an area that's more friendly for permitting and other costs and stuff like that. You're only paying once for engineering, for contracting, for all the other stuff that goes along with that process. Economies of scale is a real thing. So on a 10 megawatt site, it's was going to cost them $169,000 per megawatt to build. And this is really factual. I talked to a guy back in Wisconsin, a few weeks ago. He's building out his sites for $165,000 a megawatt. And it's a smaller site. It was 4 megawatts. But he was doing some very creative stuff of buying things from China and doing different things and had some good deals with contractors and stuff. But the more you scale, the cheaper the cost per megawatt should be as part of that process. Alrighty. So that is kind of the overall concept on scaling and pricing. On a 2 megawatt build, this is what it is. If I was going to go down to a 1 megawatt build, where can I reduce costs? Well, I've still got to pay permits. I still got to have the site engineered. Maybe I have a little bit less of the land prep, but not really. Gravel, maybe a little bit less. Electrical is going to be about the same. Fencing is about the same. Maybe I'll get a smaller transformer, but transformers aren't linear in cost. You know, you're going to maybe pay 40 grand for a 1200 kVA transformer. You're going to go through and pay 70,000 for a 3750 transformer. So buying a bigger transformer usually makes sense anyways. The work for the utility had to get done regardless. Anything over 500 kilowatts they're going to have to do, so that doesn't go down. Foundation a little bit smaller for containers. But as you see, the costs aren't dropping that much to go to 1 megawatt. If I was going to go to 3 megawatts, honestly, it's not that much more. I could probably do it for $250,000 a megawatt at moving up to 3 or 4 megawatts even, because again, it's not that much more cost. But the amount of assets we have available and our comfortability of them is a real thing. I built this from savings. This is straight up money that I had saved over the years to go through and build out this site. You guys are probably in a similar spot, unless, again, I see a lot of talk about financing and lenders and stuff on the side. Unless it's not your money, which a lot of people in the industry will say, don't build with your money. If it's not your money, go hog wild. Build out the biggest site you can for the infrastructure and the location that your budget allows for. But I wanted to keep it within frame. And in this particular one, I'm actually finally working with other people's money to get this one completed. I'm actually working with another group who's going through and covering a lot of the build out costs as part of that process. So it makes it a little bit more palatable for me to finish this build out. All right, we did that one, and that's pretty much it. All right, so I'll leave it on this screen here. All right, so I know I talked a lot for a good block of time, but I wanted to kind of cover these concepts. We haven't talked about costs that much. We've talked about how to find a site. We've talked about the right ASICs to buy. We talked a little bit about the right time to build versus buy, but we hadn't talked what does it really take and what are all the extra costs that go into building besides just getting a container and a transformer. And so I'm hoping this gave you a better picture of what it would be like if you're going to go through and partner with someone or get financing or just pay for it out of your own pocket, what it would cost to build out a 1 to 2 megawatt site, or even scaling up to a 3, 4 to 10 megawatt site as part of that process.
Thank you, Joe. That was actually very, very informative from somebody who doesn't know anything about the industry. I can see that there's a lot that goes into actually building the Bitcoin economy, and it was surprising to me, but that actually puts it all into perspective and helps me get a better footing of what I'm in for when I start stepping into this.
Yeah, and people say, what is Bitcoin backed by? This. It's backed by this. Not only the energy that we pay on a per kilowatt hour basis, but the infrastructure that goes through to build up a site. There's real monetary value there, clearly. And that really does help back Bitcoin as a network, as a sort of justification of the price and those things. Every time we go through and go up through a halving, it costs us more money to go through and mine. It costs us more money to build these things out as part of the process. So these costs are real costs, but they're also going through and supporting the Bitcoin network in general. So more and more people like you see a reason to go through and continue to build these things out. And that in turn builds out grids, which in turn builds out the sustainability energy use in our country, which you talk to a lot of people outside of the Bitcoin network, they'll say energy use is bad. I believe energy use is required for any society to advance. And so we're helping towards that process by building out the infrastructure that powers ASICs that run the Bitcoin mining network.
So I'm wondering if Taylor wants to unmute and share a little bit from his experience. Maybe he has a comment on one of your slides or has something inspirational to say here. No pressure, Taylor, but yeah, are you around?
Yeah, sure, I'm here. I actually do have a comment on Joe's discussion about energy just now. This is something that I'm very passionate about. I think that energy use is inherently good from the human perspective because energy use is associated in every way with human abundance. Also, I guess I'll go out on a limb and comment that in the scientific community and even the I'll say ecological community, quoting the co-founder of Greenpeace, they'll tell you that global warming is not being caused by humans. So I know that's a bit inflammatory, although I think I'm safe to make a comment like that in a Bitcoin mining group. But yeah, other than that, the comments that I had on the slides are kind of already in the chat. I'll just say that building up to the 10 megawatt scale is something that you can do relatively easy without doing something like building or buying a substation or doing anything like that. But once you start to go above that, you do start to get into a whole other world of electrical infrastructure when it comes to owning and building those substations. So just be aware of that. And then, if you are the kind of person who has the means or capability to build out your own warehouse, you can get it done for a little bit cheaper, but it is harder and comes with some more risks in terms of not getting the engineering that's been done for you in those containers correctly. So, I mean, you can build out a warehouse for something like 150K a megawatt if you're able to do that engineering and design work yourself. But yeah, I mean, other than that, Joe did a fantastic job on this presentation. And I'll just say from my personal journey in this, I started in my Bitcoin mining journey with Scott, helping do things like this. That was, I'll say, also the beginning of what I'll call my first real entrepreneurial venture, even though I had worked for myself previously. And I've just yesterday came to an agreement to build 50 megawatts across 6 sites for somebody. So, your dreams are possible. Get it done.
That is awesome, man. I'm so happy for you. That's very, very cool.
Yeah, that's great.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah. So, at the beginning of this, I mentioned the MasterMIND Club, and this deep dive we did today is a product of that. We get together on a weekly basis and do more informal chit chats, and we really just try to hold each other accountable to making progress on our Bitcoin mining ventures. So if that's something that's interesting to you, I do have a website here to show you. I'm going to share my screen here shortly. And
while you're doing that, I want to answer a couple questions that are in the chat. Actually, you got it up. Go for it. Keep going.
And yeah, so there it is. It's the MasterMIND Club, MasterMIND Mentorship Club. It's $100 a month, and here's how I explain it. You get one technical topic deep dive. That's, for example, what we did today, and then a community call, which is more intimate, and we go through and say, hey, where are you at today? What did you accomplish? What can we help you with next? We do that every Friday, and then 1 hour of time from my team members where we'll consult on your project and actually spend one-on-one time with you, answering any questions that you have specifically about your project. And then 15 minutes of my time if you'd like. And then also we have cool things like access to detailed project roadmaps and spreadsheets and sample blueprints and all that jazz. Really great stuff that might be able to help you to bring it to some of your shareholders or some of your vendors or customers and say, hey, here's exactly what the project looks like, and here's an example of something that somebody else did. So that might be able to really get you up and give you a leg up in what you're doing. And then also, just in general, yeah, we have a actual group on Telegram where we chit chat throughout the day and throughout the week and just bounce ideas off of each other in our in our accountability group called the MasterMIND Club. And so if that's something that's interesting to you, you can find that at 2.tool/mastermind-club. And if you go there, it's a short link, but it will redirect you to bitcoin.mastermind.club. And you'll find this here. It's $100 per month. Cancel anytime. But another thing I didn't mention is it also gives you exclusive access to minimum order quantities that we offer. So like usually when I'm selling Bitcoin miners, I'm selling them in batches of maybe 10 or 100. And I don't often just sell 1 or 2 miners because it's, to me, if I'm going to spend my time writing an invoice, I'd rather write an invoice for 100 miners. I don't get out of bed for 1 miner. But for you guys, for my club members, my team members, I'm willing to do that. So I'll get out of bed and write an invoice for 1 miner for you guys if you're a part of the MasterMIND Club. And that's very helpful for a lot of people who are just getting started, want to experiment, want to put something in their basement and see how it works, feel what it's like, hooking up a wallet to a pool and hooking the pool, putting the stratum information into their miner dashboard, and so yeah, you can get access to special offers like that. For example, that we only offer to the MasterMIND Club members. So yeah, if you have any questions about that, reach out to us on Telegram. Trevor is available, Joe is available, I'm available as well. So just find me at Offered Scott on Telegram. Make sure you're not talking to the scammer or an impersonator. And I'll teach you ways to do that to make sure that you're actually talking to the real me and not an impersonator on Telegram. But yeah, anyway, everybody, thanks for your time. Thanks for coming today. If you do need to take off, that's fine. But if you want to stick around, Joe is going to answer some questions. And if Taylor's still around, he can answer some questions as well. Very specifically, let's keep it though to costs and actual build out of your farm. So because we want to keep it on this specific topic today. All right, so at that, we'll just open it up and go ahead, turn on your microphones and mute yourself after you've asked your question.